Hello, welcome to AP Macro. I am Mr. Sanabria, and today we're learning probably the most important economic model that we're ever going to learn in this course, and that is the aggregate model, and it's that thing right there. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, what is the aggregate model? Well, it is aggregate supply and demand. The word aggregate means considering everything, right? So it's all of the supply, all of the demand. We're going to model the entire economy. And what we've been doing up till now is we've been measuring the three economic measures, right? We talked about real GDP, we talked about unemployment, we talked about price level, and now what we're going to do is we're going to take those variables, we're going to put them all on the same graph. We're going to be able to graph the state of the economy no matter how good things are going, no matter how bad things are going, or if things are going just right. So this is the most useful model we have. It shows us where we are in the business cycle, and it shows us the effect of the things that we're going to do in the future to try to counter the business cycle. So as you could imagine, this becomes central to our understanding of macroeconomics. So the first thing I want to do, because we're going to cover a lot of territory today, is start us off by just looking at what the model looks like itself. So for a couple of minutes here, I'm just going to draw the model. Then we're going to go through some slides which explain a lot of things, and you'll take some notes over definitions and why things are the way they are. And stay with me on this today because it's going to be a little lengthy, but like I said before, this is the most important model we have. So let's just go. Okay, here we are. This is an aggregate model. This is what you draw. If I were to ask you to draw the aggregate model, I want you to draw this. And let me just go ahead and tell you what we're looking at. We start with a positive quadrant, just like we always do, and the axes are labeled price level and real GDP. Think about it. This is a supply and demand graph, right? And a supply and demand graph illustrates the relationship between price and quantity. Well, if we were going to take the price of everything, that would be the general price level, right? And really what we're talking about here are relative changes in price level. So inflation would be movement up the price level, or the y-axis, and disinflation would be movement down, okay, down the y-axis, and decrease in price level. The other thing that we want to talk about, quantity, is, well, this is aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So we need the quantity of everything. Well, conveniently, real GDP is the quantity of everything, right? It is the market value of all final goods and services sold within a nation in a year. Actually, it's not the market value, it's the adjusted for inflation value. So, real GDP. So we have real GDP versus price level. Then we need, if we're going to do supply and demand graph, we need supply and demand, right? But again, this is the supply and the demand of everything. So the demand for everything is just known as aggregate demand, and it's abbreviated AD. But wait, hold on. What's going on with this extra thing? Well, there's actually two supply curves in the aggregate model. So we have what's known as short-run aggregate supply, which slopes upward just like a regular supply curve would that you're already familiar with. But then there's this other concept we're going to learn today called long-run aggregate supply. And this is a concept that's a little complicated to talk about, but we will here in a little bit, so just be looking out for that. But for now, let's just understand this is what it looks like when you graph it. And then finally, you have FE, full employment. And what we're going to find is that long-run aggregate supply exists at the level of full employment. So we've now incorporated our third and final economic measure, unemployment. So we have price level, GDP, and unemployment all graphed on the same graph. Now, what is important to note is that currently this is at long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, meaning that aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply cross at the same place as long-run aggregate supply. What you're going to find is possible is that equilibrium could exist to the left or the right of long-run aggregate supply, and that would be telling us different things. So for now, here's your introduction to the model. You know what we're talking about whenever we launch into the slides. So let's go ahead and get to the slides. All right, so here we are, slide number 1. Let's go ahead and define what aggregate demand is. Remember, referring back to the graph we just drew, that's the downward sloping curve. So aggregate demand shows the amount of real GDP that the private, public, and foreign sector collectively desire to purchase at each possible price level. What we would notice, we look really closely at this, is that we've just described SIG-X, right? The four things that you add together to give you GDP. Right? Follow my cursor. It's the amount of GDP that the private sector, private meaning not the government. Okay, so who's the private sector? Well, businesses and households are not the government. The public sector, who is that? Well, that is the government, G, and then foreign sector, net exports. And we'll go back to the graph that we just drew, and I'll refer back to this quite a few times, is we've got all of these different possible price levels, right? And if price level is really high, well then only that much quantity of aggregate demand is, or of real GDP is being demanded, right? So quantity of aggregate demand is low. If we're right here at around equilibrium price level, then there is this much real GDP being demanded, and that is a different quantity of aggregate demand. And then finally, if price level were super low, well, there would be a whole bunch of real GDP being demanded. Okay? And so that's all we're saying. So we've just described the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. Okay? The relationship, let me go back here. The relationship between price level and the level of real GDP is inverse, right? Downward sloping. So the higher the price level, the less real GDP. The lower the price level, the more real GDP. Here's the thing I want you to understand most, and that is that aggregate demand is very similar to regular demand from supply and demand that we know, microeconomic, single market supply and demand. It's similar because they both slope downward, right? They look the same, but they don't slope downward for the same reason. And that's what I really want you to understand. So here's the 3 reasons why aggregate demand is downward sloping. And these 3 reasons are going to be spread out over 4 slides. So really these first 2 slides are describing the same thing in different terms. And the thing that we're describing, and the primary reason why aggregate demand slopes downward, is known as the aggregate spending constraint. Okay? And simply put, what that means is that the higher price level is, the less stuff money will buy. And the lower price level is, the more stuff that the money that's out there will buy. And let me go ahead and show you this using our graph. Let's pretend like the amount of money that exists in the economy is $10 trillion. Okay? $10 trillion. And what this is saying is that $10 trillion will buy us this much stuff, right? But the supply of money isn't actually going to change. The thing that might change is price level. So up here, $10 trillion would only buy us this much real GDP. Why would it only buy that much? Well, because prices have gone up. That's what an increase in price level means. It means that the numbers on the price tags have gone up. So we've still only got $10 trillion in the economy, but now that $10 trillion simply won't buy as much stuff. And what if price level was really low? Well, if price level was down here, the same $10 trillion would buy a whole bunch of stuff. This is the primary reason why price level and real GDP are inversely related when we're talking about our demand for it. Okay? Now, that is fundamentally different than the reason why demand slopes downward. Okay? And the big reason why demand slopes downward can often be its behavior, right? We're going to, rather than buy this, we're going to buy that at a certain price. So let me give you an example. If I walk into the store and I wanted to buy steak, but I noticed that it's super expensive because the price of steak went up, I might just go ahead and buy chicken instead, right? That's my behavior. Well, with price level, we're talking about the price of everything. That doesn't work. If I go into the store and price level's gone up and so steak is expensive, chicken's more expensive too. Everything's more expensive. So it's a different reason that demand is downward sloping? It's just because my money's not going to go as far, regardless of how much I want. I can only purchase a certain amount. That's the spending constraint. Okay? So there's a fixed amount of money in the market to a certain extent. We'll get into in the future of how the money supply can change. But the amount of money in the economy is relatively fixed. Okay? And this is the key to understanding why, although both demand and aggregate demand slope downward, they do so for different reasons. The next slide is going to give us another example of this. Okay? The College Board often refers to this as the real balances effect. Okay? And either way, it's fine. You can call this a real balances effect. You should recognize that. It's an aggregate spending constraint. Okay? When price level is high, households and businesses cannot afford to purchase as much output. Simple, right? Price level is high, households and businesses can't afford to buy as much output. When price level is low, households and businesses can afford to purchase more output. So reason number one, the primary reason, the main thing that's going to help us understand why aggregate demand slopes downward is the aggregate spending constraint / real balances effect. Okay? Let's look at two more reasons. Reason number two is real interest effect. Okay? And this has to do with real interest rates. The higher the price level, the interest rate, which raises as well, and that tends to discourage investment. Okay? And when people invest their money, what they're doing is they're putting demands on the economy, right? But if price level is high, that also comes with higher interest rates. And if you think back to our discussion about price level and inflation, we talked about how interest rates go up when inflation's higher, right? Because you've got to get your money back. If I lend you money, I've got to get however much inflation plus whatever profit. So it's driving up interest rates. So as these interest rates are getting higher, then people who would borrow money to invest it in more capital, they're going to stop doing that. They're no longer demanding as much. Okay? A lower price level has the opposite effect. Decreases in interest rates will end up causing more investment to occur. So price level is a determinant for interest rates, and interest rates are something that's a determinant of investment, and the less investment there is, the less quantity of real GDP is being demanded, and the more investment there is, the higher quantity of real GDP is being demanded. Don't worry too much if all of that explanation of interest rate effect wasn't as clear as it could be. It will be in the future. For now, make sure, though, you are able to kind of list the different reasons. So the first one being the real balance effect, second one being interest rate effect, and the third one being foreign purchase effect. Higher price level increases the demand for relatively cheaper imports. Okay? So what that's saying is that if our prices are going up here in the United States, other prices in other countries might not be, right? Because a price level change is a value change relative to the dollar. And so, hey, it used to cost a certain amount for this, now it's more expensive. Well, there's this other item that's very similar that's made in another country, and the price of that item hasn't gone up. So maybe I'll demand that instead. Okay? And what we're going to find is the opposite is true. A lower price level increases the foreign demand for relatively cheaper U.S. exports. Alright, so now we've talked about the three reasons why aggregate demand curve slopes downward, and we've talked about what it is, right? That it's basically how much SIG-X is demanded at every given price level, which makes total sense because it is SIG-X, consumption spending, gross private investment, government spending, and net exports that you add together to get GDP. Right? So that's everything for aggregate demand. Let's go ahead and get to the bottom of aggregate supply. Let's talk about this idea that we've got two different supply curves on the same graph. Alright, and in order to understand why we have these two different supply curves, we need to understand the difference between long run and short run from the perspective of macroeconomists. Okay? Because the two supply curves we have, if we recall, are long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply. So what's the difference here? what is the difference between the long run and the short run? And in order to understand that, I first want to tell you a story, and then I'll give you the slides, and you can write those notes. But first, just listen to this story, and it will help to illustrate it. Okay, and I'll go through this pretty quickly, maybe even just play it again if I go too quick for you. But here's the deal. Let's just imagine that you are a business owner. Okay, and as a business owner, you have a building that you rent, so you sign a contract and you pay the rent, right? Maybe it's $500 a month. And I'm going to make myself some notes just so that I remember what I told you about in terms of this story, okay? So right now, you're a business owner and you have $500 a month worth of rent, okay? So rent is $500 a month. And then the next thing I want to tell you is that you also have several employees. Okay, let's just say you have one employee to make this a super simple story. And your employee, you pay them $10 an hour. Okay, $10 per hour. And we'll call that good. We'll say that's just about it for now. That's the only thing you have. You have the space that you work out of, and you have your one employee for $10 an hour. Now you're a really fair boss, okay? So you have an employee that gets paid $10 an hour, but you know that, hey, if there's inflation, I'm going to go ahead and give my employee a raise. Like, I'm not evil. I understand that if there's 10% inflation, then really my employee's taking a 10% pay cut, so I should give them a raise of 10%, right? That just makes sense. So maybe a year from now, if there's 10% inflation, I would be paying my employee $11 an hour. But for now, let's just stick. That's the situation. So you hired your employee, you're paying them $10 an hour, you signed a contract with the building owner, the lease, right? And that's $500 for the year. Let's pretend like that situation occurs. There's 10% inflation. Inflation goes to 10%. Okay? Next month, inflation's at 10%. Well, I already told you, hey, you're a nice boss, right? When you renegotiate this employee contract, you're going to give them a raise. But guess what? They signed a year contract with you. And so they're not going to renegotiate that wage increase for another, 11 months or whatever. Okay? So what's happening in the meantime? In the meantime, before you give them a raise, because even if it's not 11 months, let's say 2 or 3 months from now, you give them a raise. In the meantime, they're working for $10 an hour, even though you understand, and I understand, that if there's 10% inflation, that $10 an hour is worth 10% less. So what ends up being the case here, and follow this reasoning, is that until you give your employee a 10% raise, they're working at a discounted rate. You're getting discounted labor. Does that make sense? Now let's go ahead and apply this to the rent that you're paying. Because this case, if you're a really nice boss, you could react quickly, and maybe it only takes 2 or 3 months before you give that 10% raise. But when you sign that contract with the owner of the building, that was for a year, and it's true that you're not going to renegotiate that contract until the next time for you to sign your lease. That's going to be 11 months, right? And so for that whole rest of the year, $500 isn't worth what it was. You're getting a discount on where your the store, the office space, whatever it is that you're renting. So based on that, hopefully you understand now what's meant by this idea of getting a discount. That period of time that it takes you to adjust the prices that are actually being paid to the rates of inflation, there's an inefficiency there, and that period of time is known as the short run. So in the short run, prices have a relationship. Price level has a relationship with output. But in the long run, there isn't actually a relationship. Okay, the long run is however much time it would take for all of these price adjustments, the rent to adjust, the wages to adjust, all of your input costs, the cost of doing business. How much time would it take all of them to adjust to the new price level? That is the long run. And this is kind of an imaginary thing. By definition, it's always the short run. But we have this idea, there's a concept that given enough time, prices will all adjust to price level changes, and you'll have ultimately no effect. That price level change in the long run shouldn't have any effect at all. But in the meantime, while contracts are waiting to be renegotiated, while wages are adjusting, okay, in the meantime, that's the short run. And that's what we're going to find has an effect on creating these two different aggregate supply curves. Because remember, we talked about this in terms of you're a supplier, right? You are the business owner, and these were the costs of doing business. So let me give you now some words to define this. The long run is a period of time where input prices are completely flexible and adjust to changes in the price level, right? The period of time that it takes to adjust those wages, to adjust those contracts. In the long run, the level of real GDP supplied is independent of price level. So price level can change all at once, but given enough time, all the other prices will adjust similarly and output won't be affected. And if you go back to our model that we started with, you can see that the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical. And what that's indicating to us is that there is no relationship between real GDP and price level in the long run. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our short run. And I bet if I put myself right here, I'll be out of the way. The short run is the period of time where input prices are sticky. They do not adjust to changes in price level. And that term sticky is an academic term. So I need you to understand that the prices are sticky. And that is what is meant by the fact that your rent was stuck at $500 until you were able to re-sign the contract. That's what's meant by prices of labor, the wages that you pay. They were stuck at $10 an hour until they were renegotiated. So this difference between long run and short run comes from the reality that prices don't all just adjust instantly. Now, this is the part that's going to be a little trickier to understand. So I'll read this bullet to you, and then we'll go back to our story. In the short run, the level of real GDP supplied is directly related to price level. And that's just saying that they have a direct relationship, or a positive relationship. So short run aggregate supply slopes upward. Now what I want to do is return to our story, and I want to explain to you why that relationship exists. And here it is. Remember, in the short run, you are getting a discount on your labor and you are getting a discount on your rent, right? What happens when the cost of doing business decreases? Think back to your regular supply graph that you know. If input costs decrease, then you're willing to supply more at every price, right? The same thing applies to price level. Your input costs have gone down in the short run. You're getting a discount on labor, you're getting discount rent. And so now you're more willing and able to bring products to the market. And this applies to every business all at once. That's the interesting thing about the aggregate model. We're talking about everybody. We're talking about general price level for the entire economy as measured by CPI. And so every supplier is getting these discounts. And every supplier is willing and able to increase supply. So what you see is this positive relationship. You see that as price level increases, the bigger and bigger the discount gets, and the more and more suppliers are willing and able to supply to the market. So that's a little complicated of a story, and if you need to, go ahead and rewatch it, but we're going to move on. So here's a slide for long-run aggregate supply, and we've just explained it, right? Long-run aggregate supply, or LRAS, marks the level of full employment in the economy. Okay? So this is an interesting thing. Let's come back here to our model, and let's look at how long-run aggregate supply has no relationship with price level and real GDP, right? That's what that means. In the long run, real GDP and price level are unrelated because prices have had enough time to adjust for inflation. and it exists at the level of full employment. And when I say that it's analogous to the production possibilities curve, what I want you to do is imagine a production possibilities model like this, right? And just pretend that you pulled it off, right? You just peeled this right off of here. If I just peel this production possibilities frontier off of here, and you see it, it's just dangling in my hand, and I just stick it on here, it is the long-run aggregate supply curve. Now that is not precisely true, because we are talking about different variables, but that is an extremely useful way to think of this. The production possibilities frontier is almost the same thing as long-run aggregate supply. And what do I mean by that? Well, what we mean is that equilibrium in this market right now exists right there on long-run aggregate supply. So what I'm telling you is that this is the same as if equilibrium on your production possibilities model, which there is no equilibrium, but if the output was right here on the frontier at point A. Remember, this is an efficient economy, right? Well, guess what? This is an efficient economy. This is an economy that is at full employment. So, just a little bit of a preview, what if equilibrium was over here? It's inside the production possibilities. Let's call that point B. It looks like point B here. Do you see what we're getting at? That's where you are. So, depending on where the equilibrium between short run and aggregate demand, where that equilibrium is in relationship to the vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, that tells us the state of the economy. That's an incredibly important and useful thing for us. Okay? Because input prices are completely flexible in the long run, changes in price level do not change firms' real profits, and therefore do not change firms' level of output. This means that long-run aggregate supply is vertical at the economy's level of full employment. Now, when I read it out like that, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, even though all of that's true. Think about the story we just told, and that should help you understand why long-run aggregate supply is vertical and what the difference is between long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply, which we're going to go over next. Alright, so short-run aggregate supply can be described this way. Because input prices are sticky in the short run aggregate supply is upward sloping. This reflects the fact that in the short run, increases in price level increase firms' profits and create incentives to increase output. That's that discounted labor and rent I was just talking about. As the price level falls, firms' profit drops, and this creates an incentive to reduce output. So just kind of verbalizing what we talked about, given that story that we had. Alright, so let's go ahead and think about the aggregate supply and demand model as a whole, now that we have discussed what all of these things mean. And I'll go ahead and show you this one more time as a reminder. This is the whole model, right? And I've kind of rubbed some things with my fingers over the time here, and these don't need to be there, but it is price level versus real GDP. Full employment exists at long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply slopes upward, and aggregate demand slopes downward. The equilibrium on this model, very importantly, is the intersection between short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. It's not anywhere or anything to do with where long-run aggregate supply is. Okay? So the equilibrium is here, but that's not because long-run aggregate supply is there. That's because that's where short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand cross. Full employment exists at long-run aggregate supply. And so you would say that the economy itself is at long-run macroeconomic equilibrium when equilibrium is at the level of full employment, which is how I've drawn the model that we've been looking at. Okay, so when they all cross at the same point like this, and it looks like an asterisk or something, this is full employment equilibrium, this is long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, or sometimes just known as macroeconomic equilibrium. This is a good, healthy economy. Remember the analogy. If this were a production possibilities model, this is economy A. So now, let's take a look at what a recession might look like. Okay, a recessionary gap would look like this. Okay, notice how for the recessionary gap, equilibrium is to the left of long run. And if we trace this down to our axes, we're going to notice a couple of things. If we go ahead and trace our new equilibrium over to the axes, we can compare this to what it would look like if we were at long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. And notice what I did here is I shifted my aggregate curve, my aggregate demand curve. And so we would be here, but we're not. So what we have here is a lower price level than we would have, and we also have a lower amount of real GDP. And we also have a lower amount of employment. Okay? So this is what a recession looks like. And if we were using our production possibilities model, this would be economy B, even though that B is a little hard to see. That's a recession. You're inside the production possibilities model, but you're below full employment. And on the screen here, you've got inflationary gap. And that's when equilibrium, and let me go ahead and pull this up. Something happened with my transition here, but that's okay. The recessionary gap is explained here. Exists when equilibrium occurs below full employment output. The inflationary gap would look like this. Here is our inflationary gap. Now we're to the right of full employment. We've got too much employment. We're overemployed. Employment is below the natural rate. And you'll see that if we were at equilibrium, if we were right here, again, I've moved aggregate demand. There's a reason for that. We'll get to it later. There is a high price level, the very definition of inflation, and a lot of output. This is that economy on overdrive. The economy needs to slow down. It's causing a lot of inflation. And if we were on our production possibilities model, that is the old A prime, the inflation that we already know how to model if we're using the production possibilities model. Okay? So now you know how to graph the state of the economy. It just has everything to do with where equilibrium is in relationship to long-run aggregate supply. So don't make that confusing. You need to know, I guess from this point forward, that if equilibrium of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply occur to the left of the vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, that's a recession. If that equilibrium is right on long-run aggregate supply, that is macroeconomic equilibrium or long-run equilibrium. And if that equilibrium of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply is to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve, that is inflationary. Okay? So now what we're going to do is I'm going to pause the video here and I'm going to publish this video on its own. In our next video, we're going to get into things that would shift aggregate demand. And I'm splitting this up because I'm not sure necessarily of the pacing of how much we're going to get covered in class. So I may split this into 2 lessons, and if I do, it will be right here. So if that's all for today for you, then happy studying. If it's not, then go ahead and roll right into the next video, which is going to involve shifting aggregate demand.